So tonight we're having our conversation with Gary Oliver, obviously, and it's something that I've been thinking about for several years, and I think I mentioned it to Gary for the first time a few years ago, and we decided that the time is right. And what we're doing, it's a countercultural thing. We're just going to have a conversation. We're not going to try to be entertaining, and that's it, right? And so that's what we're going to do. Plan to wrap it up after at about 6:50. We plan to wrap it up, and so we'll just get started here. And so, so I mentioned it's a countercultural event, and that kind of fits with this photograph that Gary sent me. And truthfully, the first, for a fair number of seconds, I was wondering why Gary sent me a photo of an obviously crazed person, and I took some time, like, what is that? And he had some experience, with the Manson trials of the early 70s or the late 60s, something like that. So I thought, oh, maybe that's, so anyway, okay, but no. But then I looked at, especially around the eyes, and I thought, oh, I see it. So there's Gary, and you look at it now, and he's hardly changed, right, after these decades. And we'll just get a little background on Gary. He's had an interesting and eventful life. And Gary, if you could just walk us through these photos that we're looking at, just touching on some of the highlights. Just tell us what we're looking at here, or what these images symbolize in your mind.
Well, in the late 60s, I was up at Haight-Ashbury for the Summer of Love, and I wasn't there for that, but there to just kind of meet folks and see what it was about in San Francisco. And
is that the hippie thing?
Yep. And that was the summer. And I had to listen to a lot of groups like Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, and it was so sad.
Yeah, terrible time. And the
Back
students
then,
probably have no idea what
well, they probably don't, but...
Yeah.
And then in '68, I was in Mississippi for 2 weeks with John MacArthur doing some school programs in junior highs and high schools, a few colleges, with John Perkins. And back then, no one knew who John Perkins was, but John MacArthur's dad had started a ministry in Mendenhall, Mississippi called Voice of Calvary. And so John MacArthur asked me and a few friends, about I think 4 or 5 of us, to go down. We did assemblies in the junior highs and high schools, all black. So we were like sometimes the only white guys who had been in many of those black schools, which was a shock to me. A lot was a shock about that.
You hadn't seen that before.
And we were there when Dr. King was killed. And
in Mississippi?
Yeah, in Mississippi. And so the next day, John Perkins said, hey, we're going to go into town and meet with Charles Evers. Charles Evers was the mayor, the head of the black folks in Jackson, Mississippi. He was a brother of Medgar Evers, who had been killed. So we get through the highway patrol surrounding the back part of Jackson, and we are like the only white guys, and we go into Charles Evers' office, and he's on the phone, and he says, hold on just a sec, I'm talking to President Johnson.
Wow.
Yeah. And because Johnson was calling leaders around the country to ask them not to react yet. And
not to respond to the assassination.
Assassination with violence.
Yeah.
Then 2 days later, we were arrested by the chief of police of Mendenhall, taken in. We were each grilled, and they were going to lock us up. And our crime is that we were telling black people about Jesus.
And that was a crime.
Yeah, and I said, so don't you believe in Jesus? And he called me some expletives. He says, you're blank, blank right, I believe in Jesus. I've been head deacon of the First Baptist Church of Mendenhall for 25 years.
Wow.
And I said, well, we're just telling folks about Jesus. And he said, well, you go tell your own kind about Jesus.
Mm.
And
seems to conflict a little bit with
well, for me, yeah. And I said, so these aren't my kind? And my dad was in the Navy. This head deacon knew words that I hadn't heard my dad say. And Preston, for me, I was stunned because I grew up in Long Beach, California, and there were racial differences, but it was so sanitized in some ways.
Yeah.
But back in Mississippi in the late 80s, you went across the railroad tracks, you went back 50 years.
Oh, the late 60s.
I'm sorry, the late 60s, yeah. You went back 50 years.
Yeah.
And they got the textbooks that the white students were done with, pages torn out, things, I mean, it was unbelievable.
Yeah.
And right before they went to put us in jail, apparently we found later they got a call from Robert Kennedy's office. Now, how someone in D.C. found out that 5 white Christians had been arrested, but he got a call and they had to release us.
He'd let you go.
Yeah, and
so
he
you
said,
had some of those experiences in the 60s, sort of the hippie thing in San Francisco, civil rights
yeah.
in Mississippi, and then we come to a very different photo on the top right. What is
Yeah,
that?
I was really fortunate. I did my MDiv and THM dissertations on C.S. Lewis. So I spent about a month or so over in Oxford. I became friends with Walter Hooper, who was Lewis's secretary, and Walter was very helpful. And I said, I would love to meet Owen Barfield. He said, oh, I'm sure he would love to meet with you. I'm going, right, because I had longer hair. I didn't look quite as...
And these are figures that are important sort of in the world of C.S. Lewis.
Oh, yeah, because, Walter Hooper was his secretary. And Walter Hooper has found a lot of his letters and things and helped keep Lewis's legacy in some ways alive. Yeah. Owen Barfield was one of his best friends growing up. He was his lawyer and also part of the Inklings. And so Mr.
A literary group that C.S. Lewis was part of.
Yeah. And they would meet once a week with J.R. Tolkien and a bunch of others. So I spent about 3 hours at Barfield's private home out in the country and just talked about Lewis. And one thing, Preston, that struck me, I asked probably a question everybody asked. I said, Mr. Barfield, what about your friend Jack Lewis was the most impressive or most impactful for you? And he paused and looked me right in the eyes and said, you know, Gary, no matter how famous Jack became, cover of Time magazine, million booksellers, no matter how big he became, he never let on that his opinion was more valuable than yours.
That's the C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. And I thought that's quite a... So
important.
these were some formative things for me. And then in the 90s, I had an opportunity to be a part of the founding Promise Keepers. We met several times before the first event, and was with him for 10 years, spoke to, well, over 1 million men in live venues, Shea Stadium, the Coliseum, and it was just amazing to see in those 10 years a real revival among men. So just some of the influences.
Some of the things. We'll just look at these. These are some, actually a small number of Gary's books. If you look it up at Amazon, you'll see that he's published many books. And then the Center for Healthy Relationships. Just tell us a bit about your work here at JBU.
Well, in '98, after a lot of prayer and thought and saying no twice, my late wife Carrie and I came back to start the center. And the genius, I think, of the center, Preston, for me was I'd spent much of my life, I was trained as a theologian. So I have an MDiv from Talbot Seminary and a THM from Fuller. But then the Lord led me to be trained as a clinical psychologist. I have an MA and PhD in psychology. And, but my life had been spent doing remedial counseling, which is good. I still have a small private practice. But I found so often people came in with needs that if they'd had some help a year or 2 years before that, their marriage, their life would not have entered into crisis mode. So the vision of the center was to do education, enrichment, encouragement, not just mending broken marriages, but building strong, healthy ones. And not just marriages, but all kinds of relationships.
Sure, you're busy doing all
So in some ways, this was a dream. So I've been here since 1998, and CHR is still going.
Yeah. So Gary, we're going to transition here, but you've mentioned that some people have asked about your accent. And you've asked, some people have said to you that they've asked if you're from New Jersey.
Yeah.
Or something like that. So tell us where your accent comes from.
Well, this is not a New Jersey accent, okay? This is an MD Anderson Cancer Center accent. I'll tell in a little bit, but a number of years ago, I had 80% of my tongue removed. And they took muscle off my leg and put it in my mouth. So I have 20% of my tongue, and 80% is muscle from my legs. So some folks have their foot in their mouth. I have my whole leg in my mouth. Okay.
Yeah.
That's funny for them. It's not funny. No.
Yeah. That's so
And
cool.
but I think with the graphics, and I'll talk slow enough that you'll understand most of what I say.
Yeah. Gary, the other day you and I, as we sort of move into the main topic here, which is the Valley of the Shadow, was my original title was Living in the Valley of the Shadow, and you insisted that we add something about joy, and then we came to light and joy in the Valley of the Shadow. But when you and I met a few days ago and we were talking about this, you made this point, which I jotted down after you said it. You said, for you, this hasn't just been the Valley of the Shadow of Death, but actual death. And and we'll talk about that, to the extent that you want to, and then, as you've indicated, some significant bouts with cancer. And let's just sort of tick through this. The folks here can read this, but maybe just work through it and just say what comes to mind. Just a couple sentences maybe for each one, and we have the email that we can spend some time with.
Okay. Well, in 2005, my dad has had extended hospitalizations, and so my dad passed, and my late wife Carrie had been having some stomach problems for about 4 or 5 months. So we finally were sent to Kansas City, and she was told that she had a massive metastatic pancreatic cancer and had 3 to 6 months to live, which was, we were stunned, of course. So that began trips back and forth to MD Anderson and treatments, and it was inoperable, so the prognosis with pancreatic cancer is not good. And then in 2006, I had my 5th cancer surgery. I had chemotherapy and radiation, so I was bald for a while. And both of my friends said I looked rather nice bald, but the other ones didn't. And radiation, I couldn't talk. I wrote a note to the doctor when my voice came back. He said there's a 50-50 chance that it will come back. Yeah. So that was hard. But then on May 5th, my middle son, Matt, 23 years old, died. And burying your mom and dad, burying family, and I'd done a number of funerals with my various roles is one thing, but every loss is unique. And because you know someone who's lost a mom or dad, does not mean you know what loss is or understand their loss. Every loss is unique, who it is, when it happens. And I'm in shock. I'm trying to manage things. I'm grieving my son, but I don't really have time because Carrie's not doing well. By that time, she's been told she needed to go for hospice. And probably once a week I was taken to the ER to pump out about 1 liter of fluid because her stomach became distended. She looked like she had been in Auschwitz and Dachau, just skin and bones. She never lost her smile, and her eyes could still light up, and she still loved Jesus. But it was hard for her to even get around. And so I'm caring for my youngest son who's there, so I'm still a dad, still at CHR, and trying to care for Carrie. And on July 2nd, Carrie died. And which wasn't a surprise, but even though you know it might come, it's always a surprise. And I remember I wrote down, probably 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I've never experienced a longer winter with massive waves of weariness and unrelenting discouragement. I often turned to prayer, feeling besieged, attacked, overwhelmed, wondered where I get the energy to do the next task or even take the next step, and how to deal with all this stuff. Suddenly I'm a widower, and I'm a single dad. And like a small thing that wasn't small, like in the middle of the night sometimes I would kind of half wake up and move my foot over to touch Carrie's. But my foot would keep on going, there was no foot there. And finally I would wake up and it would hit me and just burst out sobbing. And after a while, okay, this is what it's like. But it's, when you have someone for 27 years removed out of your life, you look kind of normal, but you're not. And you don't realize how a son, how a spouse, how people become a part of who you are. And so I had no companion to share with. I mean, after we lost Matt, Carrie and I could talk a bit, but now there was no one to talk to. And I felt incredibly alone. And I don't remember ever feeling that alone. Now, there were some good friends, and some are here tonight, who loved and prayed for and supported, and I can't overstate the power of just a friend being present. But I was so massively alone. And it was bittersweet. For about 6 months, Preston, I was so aware of what was and what would never be again. And at times I just found myself sobbing. At times I ran out of tears, but I'd keep on sobbing. But over a 6-7 month period, I began to think more about one reason why I grieved so hard is because I was loved so well, and I loved well. And grief can make us forget the joy and the warmth and what we lost, which makes the loss so great. And so over time, I began to, in the middle of tears, saying, God, thank you for my dad, and thank you for Matt, and thank you for Carrie. And I found that as I gave God gratitude, not as a way to avoid the pain. Grief isn't something you pretend isn't there, but in the midst of the grief, to give God thanks. It was amazing how I felt some strength and energy. The grief didn't magically go away. I had a memory last about a week and a half ago, and about Matt, and I just had tears in my eyes. But that's okay. That's what good, healthy grief looks like. You don't get over someone that you really loved. You can't let it define who you are. But grief kind of is like an onion. You peel off one layer and there's another one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I want to jump ahead because we've only got halfway down. I mean, the stuff keeps coming, and we'll return to that screen. But I want to go to this one. I asked you, of all the things you've written, is there an article, is there a book that's most important to you in your own mind? And you mentioned actually an essay you wrote, and we see the title there, Lessons Learned from the Doorstep of Death. And folks can get this from you, but really the word I want to focus on is what I have bolded there, resources, because I hear the words you're saying, but I have no way of understanding them. I haven't experienced anything remotely close to what you're talking about. I hear the words, but when you use that word, I bring in. I'm reminded of something Aristotle said. In Aristotle's Ethics, he brings up the idea of friendship with the self. Mm-hmm. What are the marks of a person who is his or her own good friend? And one of the marks of such a person is that he or she fills the mind with good resources, right? Mm-hmm. And if we're filling our minds with things that are not useful, if we're filling our mind with gunk, then we're not being our own good friends. It's in our own self-interest to fill our minds with good things. If we think of our mind as a library, what is on the shelves? Yeah. And so this is a question I want to pitch to you, because what you've described thus far is literally unimaginable to me. I have no conception of what it would be. But as we say, there's more to come. But I'm wondering, what resources did you bring into that experience that you were able to draw on to keep moving? Because as you and I were talking a few days ago, you made the obvious point that the cancer alone would stop a lot of folks in their tracks, psychologically, spiritually. The deaths alone would stop a lot of people in their tracks, psychologically, spiritually. Completely understandable in both cases. You're getting hammered with these things simultaneously. Yeah. So what were the resources, the spiritual resources, the psychological, whatever comes to your mind, what resources had you stored up in the library of your mind, in your soul, that you were able to draw on in this time?
Preston, I'd known so many people growing up, and even at that time, whose faith was primarily cerebral, intellectual. They maybe knew original Greek, they'd memorized hundreds of verses,
Yeah.
but they didn't have, or didn't seem to have, a real intimate relationship with Christ. Their prayer was kind of, now and then, and God had really convinced me, and God used some circumstances, a few of which we've talked about, to set your mind on things above. So not just Bible memory, but Bible application. God, what does it look like to be a doer of the word and not just a hearer, And in Psalm 139, David didn't write, search my wife, O God, and know her heart, or try my husband and know his thoughts, and not me to point out the narcissistic, histrionic way. No, it says, search me, O God. Know my heart, try me. And with God's help and a handful of friends and Carrie and others, I really asked God to search me. And so, the time to prepare for a crisis is not when you have it. And so God allowed me to walk into it with, I think, a depth of love for the Lord and understanding of the role of the Holy Spirit. I think a bit of knowledge about Greek because of my role as a psychologist. But I knew that God was a promise keeper, not just because of the name of the group.
Yeah.
I knew God wasn't just a promise maker. I knew God had no choice but to keep his word. I knew that circumstances don't determine our reality. Now, our circumstances massively impact our reality. I mean, I'll never be the same because of some of the things that have happened to me. But that didn't determine my value, my worth, who God is, why I'm here, and what he might have for me. So how can I learn from and be responsive to circumstances without that becoming all that I am? And so my time in the Word, the Holy Spirit, prayer, some spiritual disciplines, all those things became of great value. Meditation, just time, again, not in the Word for head knowledge, but time in the Word for application.
Yeah.
So I could be in tears, and I would have in my mind go through, I'll never leave you or forsake you. I'm here with you. I'm collecting your tears in a bottle. Now, I have no idea what that means, but the Bible says it.
Yeah.
And to me, what that means is God really cares about me, especially when I don't feel like it, when I feel like my prayers are bouncing off asbestos, when I'm having wave after wave, where I'm burying family, and I have all these cancers, and so, this is great.
Yeah.
Just trust in Jesus, life will be fun. Well, that wasn't my story.
Did you, and this may be a terrible question, but, just whatever your response is. Do you feel like, as you're experiencing this, and perhaps as you still do, that you understand the crucifixion more deeply?
Yeah.
When Jesus cries out, why have you forsaken me? Like, enough already.
And if God the Son felt that way, I mean, he'd been around for a while.
Yeah.
And he was truly God and truly man, and I understood aloneness. Obviously nothing like our Lord, but that it's a process. That I can let my losses define me. I know this sounds cliche, and I hate cliche, okay? Really.
Yeah.
Okay, it's insulting. Having said that caveat, I can let my losses define me or refine me. And with God's help and with some prayer and love of some friends who usually had no idea what to say, but I knew they were there, I think God began to use this to refine me.
Well, let me, you mentioned that the folks who are there, and, there are folks in this crowd in this audience who can relate to, some of what you're saying. There are many who, at some point in the future, will. What is the worst thing that a person can say to someone who is facing the kinds of things that you described, and what's the best thing that a person can say or do? What's the worst and the best thing that a person can say?
You know, the worst thing may surprise you, but the worst thing is I understand.
Yeah, because they don't.
You don't. I mean,
Yeah.
give me a break, Jack.
Yeah.
You know, so you've lost a mother, and my mother's died. Well, you didn't lose my mother.
Yeah.
You know, and I had some people say, well, I understand, and that really ticked me off. I mean, I maintain a modicum of control, which I don't always do.
Yeah.
But yeah, to say I understand, that's so insensitive, it's presumptuous. Now, to say I understand pain, I understand loss, I understand an ache that won't go away, because I've had that. But that's not the same as I understand where you're at right now. And so often I understand becomes an excuse we can use not to listen. Because if I listen, it's messy. And we think we're supposed to have an answer, especially if you're a male and you've been trained theologically and you're a psychologist. You're paid to have an answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But just to listen and to be present.
Is that the best thing?
Yeah. The best thing to say is nothing.
So Job's friends had it right so long as their mouths were shut.
Yeah, if they had
Yeah.
kept the duct tape over their mouths,
Yeah.
great. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's, now to say I'm here for you, I'm praying for you. The day after Matt died, two of my friends, dear friends, some Promise Keepers, one was a pastor of a mega church in Seattle, one flew up from Florida, they appeared at my doorstep. These guys had probably done 300 or 400 funerals. Dear friends, okay? I opened my door, Rick and Dale are there, their eyes are bloodshot, and they embraced me, and we sobbed for 3 or 4 minutes. And then Dale said, Gary, I have no idea what to say, except I love you, we love you, we're here. So yeah, the worst thing is I understand.
Yeah.
And the best is to keep quiet, and then to say, how can I help? I'm praying for you, but don't try to fix it.
Yeah, I hear that. Let's go, looks like let me see. Oh, we're not able to go back. Are we able to, is there a tech person there? Well, you have the list in front of you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So in 2008, my only sibling, my older sister, Marcia, died. And she was about 4 years older than me, and she had an amazing memory. In fact, our family joke was that she probably remembered her, her conception. That's how good her memory was. And I had no idea when Marcia died, I'd buried my entire biological family.
Wow.
And she was the only one who really knew me, family history. We didn't have a large family, and that was devastating. I mean, at that point, I really felt super alone. And so I kind of worked through that, and then in 2010, in May, I went down to MD Anderson for a checkup,
Yeah.
and I think maybe some of that's in the letter that you passed out, but let me just read the paragraph.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Let me, well, let's go through the list real quick, and then we'll come back to this.
So in 2010, I had 80% of my tongue removed. So I wake up, I was on a ventilator for 2 days, I was in ICU for 3 days before they brought me out. And I have tubes everywhere, places where tubes should never be, and they cut places for new ones. Yeah. And the doctor tells me that you'll never speak again. You'll never be able to eat or chew. You don't have a tongue. You've probably lost all of your salivary glands and taste buds. And we've had to reconfigure your throat. So if you try to, you'll probably choke. You'll have a feeding tube the rest of your life.
Wow.
And now I have kind of a warped sense of humor. So one of the first things I said was, "Oh, bummer." It was a bummer, but But then God brought a lot of things to my mind. For example,
Yeah.
Gary, I'm not done with you yet. Gary, I can use you. You gave me your tongue when you gave me your life, but I can use you, okay?
Yeah.
This is not the end of the story. But I'm saying, what I've done my whole life, I can't do.
Because
And
they're saying you're not going to be able to speak.
oh yeah, I can't speak, I can't travel, so I had about a year and a half, 2 years of stuff booked out, probably 2 or 3 international things a year, cancel everything.
Yeah.
And I mean, who wants to go to a relationship center where a guy can't even talk? I mean, that's a drag. It's not much fun. So, but here's a cool thing. I had to stay in Houston for about a month. So on my way from MD Anderson to a friend's house, I knew there was a Chick-fil-A. And I'd been married about 4 years after Carrie's passing, and my precious wife, Linda, who was a nurse, an ICU nurse, was so massively helpful. And so Linda's driving, I can't talk, I got tubes and bottles and stuff, and I see the Chick-fil-A, and so I motion over, and I grunt, and she says, yeah, Chick-fil-A. And I said,
Yeah.
oh, you want me in? Anyway, so she goes in drive-through line. She says, Gary, your mouth is sewn shut. And I went like this. And she said, Guinness? And I said, no. She said, oh,
Yeah.
Coke, okay. And so she got me a Coke. I wedged a straw in this corner of my mouth, and I kind of threw my head back, and I got a couple of drops of Coke in my mouth. And I could taste the Coke. And I started sobbing uncontrollably. I mean, how pathetic is that? I can taste Coke, and it was unbelievable because they said I'd never be able to taste. And it just struck me, and I go back to that moment, how many things I had never given God thanks for. I hadn't thanked God for my tongue. I'd never thanked God for a healthy pancreas. I mean, I know that sounds silly.
No, it doesn't.
I hadn't thanked God for my feet, my legs, my eyes, my sight. I took everything for granted. I would moan and complain over what I didn't have, especially if someone had it better than me.
Yeah.
But my gratitude, anyway, a taste of Coke, and my whole life has changed. So God used a lot of the pain and stuff to help reframe for me goodness and grace and mercy and loving kindness in some mighty, mighty ways.
Yeah, I hear
Then I got home and I couldn't talk, so I spent about 5 months in front of the mirror saying my ABCs. I couldn't say my ABCs. And there were probably 3 or 4 times, I think I told you, where I'd be there for 10 minutes. And it was like, you know, and I would just start sobbing. I would say, God, I can't even say my ABCs. But I practiced, and finally after about 5 minutes, I began to sound like an Elmer Fudd who was intoxicated.
Elmer Fudd was intoxicated.
Yeah, so yeah.
We're making progress, though.
Yeah, but well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then about 6 months later, I went back down to MD Anderson in November for a checkup. And the doctor walked in, and I'd done enough therapy to know what the nonverbals was. Gary, you have 3 tumors. It's metastasized. They're inoperable. And he said, you may have 3 months to live. You have advanced stage 4. Now that really is a bummer.
Yeah.
Stage 3 is well, actually all stages are a bummer, but advanced stage 4 means, you know, you have less than 3 months to live. Go home and call hospice. As we were leaving the hospital, I got a call. And they said they just found FDA had released a chemo cocktail of 3 of the most, he said, butt-kicking chemos. He said, and do you want to try it? Because one of the things is your kind of cancer. I said, well, less than 3 months, hey, well, why not? So they gave it to me. I mean, it knocked me out. I couldn't even walk to my mailbox. I could barely walk from my bed to my office at home for 3 months. Went back down to MD Anderson, and they said, we can't find the tumors.
Wow.
He said, you still have cancer. And so I take some chemo every morning. He said, but he said, you know. So yeah, that was amazing. So
Yeah. Well, you sent me this photo, and
oh yeah.
it sort of stopped me in my tracks. Just what comes to your mind when you see that
Well,
photo?
Matt's on the left, and there's Andrew, is the little guy there. He's now in Los Angeles. There's Carrie Elizabeth, and that's me, and that's my oldest son, Nathan, who's now a therapist in West Palm Beach, Florida.
Okay.
And yeah, that's back in the day.
Back in the day.
And to look at that, and apart from me, 2 of those 4 are gone, you know, and
Well,
I have a ton of great memories, a ton of things to be thankful for, and the pain's still there. But my joy is greater than my pain, and that's why I wanted to talk with you about that title. Because for me, getting through grief and loss is one thing, surviving it. My bias is that God's best for us is not just to survive it. Christ didn't die and rise again for me to tread water. You know, Ephesians 3:20, now unto him was able to do exceedingly abundantly beyond all we ask or think. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not magic. But the good news is not that I will help you barely make it. Okay?
Yeah.
Healing takes time, but it can happen.
Yeah.
And while you still feel the wound, there was enormous joy and a greater sense of God's goodness, his mercy, his presence.
Let's go to the email. I think you have a copy there, and most of the folks in the crowd have a copy. And we've got about 20 minutes left, and I want to spend time now. And we're not going to look at the whole email. Now you should know that my basic policy with emails is that they're longer than 2 paragraphs. I delete them. Right, so I'm you know,
and you've deleted many of mine.
Probably.
But
yeah, but this one, when you wrote this email on May 4th, 2010, you obviously had no. In fact, you didn't remember writing it when I brought it up to you.
I didn't.
But it has stuck with me ever since. And really, there's the one sentence that I find incomprehensible, and I would love to hear you. I think you've talked about it already, but I'd love to hear you talk about it a little bit more. And folks can read this, and you're spelling this out, and this is before you're going to have 80% of your tongue removed. But the line is in the long paragraph toward the end, where you say, for some reason, and this is really the part that stuck out to me, for some reason I'm one of those folks God has chosen to be a billboard for his goodness, mercy, and grace, and to be a kind of living object lesson for his faithfulness in the midst of, and at times in spite of, difficult times. And the phrase that really, you know, just made this note so memorable to me is this thing, for some reason I'm one of those folks God has chosen to be a billboard for his goodness, mercy, and grace. I mean, you know, I'm just interested in hearing you respond to that. I don't understand it at all.
I have known so many Christians who, once they had a loss, that defined them for the rest of their lives, that changed how they viewed God. And there was little sense of, you know, you can grieve loss and still have joy. So like I said earlier, I still grieve what will never be again. But that grief, that bitter piece, is overcome by the much larger piece of God's grace and mercy. See, I haven't lost anybody. I know where everybody's at.
Mm.
So they're not here, but I've not lost anybody. And yeah, I have chunks of me that are no longer there. Okay,
Yeah.
But I still have purpose and joy. And I'm a legacy in some ways. My life, my joy, my love, my compassion, my patience is a legacy for those that I've lost. So their legacy is not just a piece of granite somewhere. Okay?
And I'm guessing you found a lot of opportunities not to tell people you understand,
Yeah.
but to draw on your experiences to be useful to others as they're experiencing these tremendous difficulties.
Yeah, some of that article you mentioned, lessons learned from Doors of Death. One of the lessons was, in fact, I think I noted here, yeah. I found in MD Anderson that most people you see there from all over the world are sad. Of course, many are bald, or they have their head covered and they're moving slowly, or they're in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And so I realized that if I would smile at people, they would smile back. And so I'm going back to MD Anderson in December for my annual checkup. And before I go, in fact, I already have, I'm praying about, God, who would you have me encourage? And I encourage in two ways. One is I just smile at folks. I mean, not in a goofy way. But, and then when you first get there, you have to go and give blood and other fluids that they might want. And you have a wristband. If you have a wristband that says that you're a member of the club, okay, that you're a member of the club.
Yeah.
And so I'll look for folks who are sitting by themselves who appear particularly sad. I'll sit down and make sure my wristband is showing. And then if they don't say something, I'll turn over and I'll say, well, is this your first time here? And yes or no. And well, what are you here for? Enough to talk about there. And usually they've been there a couple of times, maybe. Usually it's their first sitting cancer.
Yeah.
How about you? And I'll say, well, I've had cancer 8 times. And really? They asked me to talk about it. And, well, how many times have you been here? And probably between 45 and 50.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, their view of their situation changes. Not to minimize it. You can never minimize stage 1, 2. You can't minimize the loss.
Yeah.
Because I've had a bunch of losses does not make me something special. A loss is a loss. But it helps them reframe it. And then you almost always ask, well, how have you done it? So I have a chance just to talk and share my story.
There's the opportunity.
Yeah.
So a few minutes ago, I said we had 20 minutes left. At this point, we just have 5. I misread that. But there are a few things that we want to do. I encourage people to read this email. In my 16 years here at JBU, this is really the only one that stuck with me as sort of a powerful statement that I don't understand, but yet I see the power of it. And I do encourage folks to read it, and we have some more copies up here if folks don't have it. I think it's just a remarkable thing.
Thank you.
But just briefly, if you could tell us first, if you could just tell us just in a couple sentences why these photos are important to you, then tell us what this is behind me, and then we'll wrap it up.
Someone once said that transparency allows you to see the pain. Vulnerability allows you to feel and touch the pain. And as we prepared for this conversation, my prayer was that I would let folks not just see what I've been through, but maybe be vulnerable to feel and touch a wee bit of it. When I came back from MD Anderson after my surgery here, I could barely walk. Because of surgery, they had to teach me how to walk again, which is very embarrassing. I remember passing the 100 steps on the way home.
Over here at JBU.
Yeah, here at JBU. And I thought, I'll never climb those again. And on my bucket list had been to climb to the top of the Grand Teton. I thought, well, I can barely walk. So about 2 years ago, I and a friend, Greg Bettis, we climbed to the top of the Grand Teton. And it's not about that, but what it's about is, Preston, I did it one step at a time. One step at a time. And it hurt, and the respiration, and the breathing, and I've climbed my entire life, but as you get older, it becomes a wee bit harder. And when you've had certain surgeries, it cramps your style. Okay? I didn't look terribly buff or impressive, but you know what?
You did it.
I got to the top.
And there you are.
Yeah, and some people think, how did I do it? How have I made it? Well, first of all, I haven't just survived. I haven't just made it, number one. Number two, I did it one step at a time. And that is so important. And sometimes it's 2 steps forward, one step back. And then I have folks who will often say, I don't know how you did this, you're amazing, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I don't mean to minimize that. Those are real compliments. but I'm really not. My friends know I'm a pretty ordinary guy with a mediocre sense of humor, but I value relationships, I love Jesus, and I believe what he says. And so people think I could never go through what you've gone through, and my point is always, well, yes, you could, because I went through it one loss at a time. See, some of you see this painting here, and if you had come up, and Preston, explain this painting, will you?
Nothing there.
Nothing here.
Yeah.
You see, if I would have said nice canvas, you would have been really impressed, right? No, you don't pay for canvas. It's not about the canvas. What it's about is the artist. This has value. And where did this come from? The painting, yeah.
That's Dave Anderson's
Yeah,
painting. Yeah,
Dave Anderson's painting. And the beauty of this is not that Dave has great taste in canvas. Okay, boy, Dave knows canvas. But that he's an artist. And the beauty is in what the artist puts on the canvas. Now, I know that we're different than canvas, because we can respond and stuff, but it would grieve me. It would make me sad if folks left here thinking that Gary is some this or that, because I'm not. I'm just an ordinary guy who kept on trusting Jesus and who am still very weak and still have times where I'm very sad, but the joy from what was and what is so much greater than what I've lost. My losses affected me, but they don't define me. So when we have grief, we need to grieve. And when we have loss and death and dying isn't fun. And as I think I said in this note, someday it'll be my turn to cross the river. And at that time, that would be great. But until then, I don't want to live as if we have a good God and, I hope everything works out. But I have a God that I can trust, regardless of the circumstances. And I think that's why I wanted the joy in the valley of the shadow. Because see, my valley lasted about 7 years. And it was dark, and it wasn't just a shadow of death, there were several deaths. And God was faithful and merciful. And we can be more than conquerors. We don't have to be victims.
Well, Gary, as we wrap this up, I just want to, over the years, I've read this email, and you and I have talked on and off and on over the years, and I appreciate what you say about being a normal Joe. That's, and I hear what you're saying. I've been in. I guess truthfully, I've just been sort of mystified. I mean, how a person can get through all this and still be who you are. That is very difficult for me to understand. It's impossible for me to understand, which I guess is why I've been so eager to do this, just to hear you talk. We love you, and we really appreciate you.
You're very kind.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What I want to do is end with a prayer. And at the beginning of the semester, I asked a pastor in California who had a very big impact on me if he would write a prayer that I could pray before class. And so we'll end with this prayer. O Lord, you spoke the word and breathed the Spirit, and everything that is came into being. Speak your word and breathe your Spirit on us, in our lives, in our classrooms, at this university. Let your light shine in our hearts and minds. Give to us wisdom and love. Give to students the grace to be present, to attend, to listen for that wisdom which the Lord may impart, and to embrace the love which the Lord surely bestows. And we thank you, Lord, for Gary and for his example. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
So thank you very much for coming. Please come up and greet Gary. We appreciate it. Bye-bye.